The farmer watched the barn from a distance, its dark silhouette stark against the twilight. There were no flames yet, but in his mind the fire already consumed the rotten planks, and more importantly, the last obstacle to his inheritance. A cold, calculating smile stretched his lips as he imagined the old woman's fate inside. His mother, frail and forgotten, shivered on the damp floor, the door locked, the icy air piercing her thin clothes. Nature, he thought, would take care of the rest, but nature had its own guardians. A white, almost ghostly figure emerged from the forest's darkness, its ice-blue eyes fixed on the barn. The legendary albino tiger was no ordinary predator. It sensed the injustice, the fragility of the abandoned life. With a roar that made the ground tremble and the farmer's blood run cold, the beast lunged at the door, shattering it in a single powerful blow. The tiger's roar was not just a sound. It was a primal force that tore through the night air and, more importantly, tore through the web of certainties the farmer had woven in his sick mind. The blow that shattered the barn door was not just splintered wood. It was the sound of his plan falling apart into 1,000 pieces. The cold smile on his lips froze, then contorted into a grimace of disbelief. His eyes, once filled with macabre satisfaction, now widened, fixed on the imposing figure materializing at the barn's entrance. An albino tiger. Legendary. Impossible. Inside, the old mother, huddled on the cold, damp floor, heard the crash. Her frail body trembled, not just from the cold, but from an ancestral fear she couldn't identify. Was this the end? The barn was locked, the air thin, and she knew her son had abandoned her there to die. A solitary tear traced a path down her wrinkled face, mixing with dirt and sweat. But then, a gigantic shadow filled the broken doorway. It wasn't her son's slender, cruel figure, but something much larger, much whiter, with eyes that gleamed like sapphires in the gloom. The tiger, its white coat almost luminous in the dark, did not hesitate. Its blue eyes, once fixed on the farmer, now turned to the huddled figure on the floor. There was something there, a fragility so profound, an injustice so palpable that the beast felt a calling. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't territoriality, it was the essence of its own legend, the protection of the innocent, the correction of imbalances that nature sometimes allowed. With slow, deliberate steps, the animal entered the barn, its muscular body moving with a silent grace that belied its brutal strength. The farmer, still paralyzed, watched the scene, as if trapped in a nightmare. The tiger wasn't there for him, it was there for her. His mother, the woman he had condemned to death. The fire, which he had so carefully started, began to manifest. Thick, acrid smoke started to seep from the barn's cracks, and the smell of burning wood, once a sign of victory, was now an omen of disaster. The flames, small and timid at first, licked at the dry planks, gaining strength with each gust of air that entered through the destroyed door. Inside the barn, the old mother raised her head, her cloudy eyes meeting the tiger's. There was no ferocity there, only an intensity that seemed to see through her soul. The animal approached, and instead of attacking, it lowered its head, nuzzling her shoulder with surprising delicacy for a creature of its size. It was a gesture of recognition, of protection. The woman, who had accepted her fate, felt a strange warmth, not from the approaching fire, but from the presence of that legendary beast. The tiger then did something that defied all logic. With a gentle but firm movement, it nudged her. Not aggressively, but like a shepherd guiding his flock. The old woman, confused but feeling an undeniable urgency, tried to stand. Her legs, weakened by age and fear, barely supported her. The tiger noticed. With a low growl, it positioned itself so she could lean on its robust flank. It was an escape, a salvation, and the farmer, at a safe but still visible distance, felt his blood run cold. Flames now danced visibly on the barn's inner walls, casting flickering shadows that gave the scene an infernal air. The heat intensified, the air grew denser. Time was running out. The tiger, with the old mother leaning on its body, began to move slowly towards the open door. Each step was a challenge for the woman, but the animal's strength and determination were unwavering. It would get her out. It would save her, and with that, it would destroy everything the farmer had planned. The farmer watched, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and despair. His plan, so carefully orchestrated, was being undone by a creature he considered a myth. The inheritance which he already felt in his grasp slipped like sand through his fingers. And worse, the image of his mother being rescued by a tiger, a wild animal, while he, her son, had abandoned her, was a stain that not even the barn fire could erase. He needed to act. He needed to stop it. But what could a man do against a living legend, especially one that seemed to have nature's own justice on its side? The barn roared with flames, and the white figure of the tiger, with the old woman in its symbolic embrace, emerged from the darkness and hell, straight into the cold but free night. The night air, once complicit in the farmer's murderous silence, now vibrated with the roar of flames and the echo of a shattered plan. The barn, which was meant to be the old mother's tomb and the cradle of a new fortune, rapidly transformed into a crackling inferno, spitting smoke and embers against the starry sky. But the true hell for the farmer was the scene unfolding before him, the imposing figure of the albino tiger, emerging from the broken door with his mother, the supposed victim, leaning on its muscular flank. The frozen smile on the farmer's face was no longer one of satisfaction, but of paralyzing horror. Disbelief gave way to a wild fury, a corrosive despair that burned more intensely than the fire devouring his possessions. The inheritance, the future he had drawn with such cruel and calculating strokes, slipped through his fingers like the barn's smoke. It was unacceptable. It was impossible. He could not allow it. His eyes swept the ground, searching for something, anything, a piece of wood, a tool, a weapon. His gaze landed on the old hunting shotgun, leaning against the house wall, just a few meters away. A spark of insane hope ignited in his troubled mind. A myth, an animal, could not oppose the will of a determined man. Not his will. As the farmer stumbled towards the shotgun, the tiger, with its precious cargo, continued its slow, deliberate exit from the inferno. Each step the beast took was a challenge for the old mother, whose legs faltered, but the animal's strength and determination were unwavering. Thick, acrid smoke whipped at their faces. Flames licked at the planks ever closer, but the tiger did not hurry. Its priority, the safety of the fragile life it protected. Its blue eyes, once fixed on the farmer, now turned to the forest's darkness, as if already glimpsing a refuge. The old mother, coughing and gasping, felt the intense heat of the fire on her back and the smell of burning invading her lungs. But strangely, the fear that had paralyzed her on the barn's damp floor had diminished, replaced by a sense of awe and an inexplicable trust in that wild creature. She could barely process what was happening. Her mind, clouded by age and shock, only registered the tiger's protective strength and the distant sight of her son, a figure distorted by smoke and pain. The farmer reached the shotgun, his hands trembling as he gripped it. The cold metal in his palms was a reminder of his own mortality, but also a promise of power. He raised the weapon, pointing it at the white figure silhouetted against the fire's red-orange backdrop. One shot, a single shot, could solve everything. It could bring down the animal, scare the old woman, and perhaps, just perhaps, he could still salvage something from his ruined plan. But the tiger, a creature of primal instincts and almost supernatural intelligence, perceived the threat. Its blue eyes, which had shown compassion, now gleamed with an ancestral ferocity. It sensed the farmer's murderous intent, the same intent that had condemned the old woman to death. With a low, guttural growl, the animal pushed the mother behind itself, shielding her with its massive body. It was a living shield, a wall of muscle and legend. The farmer hesitated. The tiger was not just a target. It was a force of nature, an entity that seemed to defy the world's laws. The gleam in the animal's eyes was a warning, a challenge that made the farmer's blood run cold again. Even with the shotgun in hand, he felt small, insignificant, before the majesty and power of that beast. The barn at that instant let out a structural groan. One of its side walls, consumed by flames, collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and incandescent debris. The heat intensified, the smoke became suffocating. The surrounding forest, once dark and silent, was now illuminated by a sinister glow, and the smell of smoke spread for miles. The tiger seized the farmer's momentary distraction. With a swift and surprising movement, it turned, not to attack, but to complete its escape. With the old mother still leaning on it, but now more protected, it made a graceful leap, covering the distance to the forest's edge in a few seconds. The white figure vanished among the dark trees, taking with it not only the old woman's life, but also the farmer's sanity and future. The farmer stood there, alone, the shotgun heavy and useless in his hands. The fire roared behind him, consuming the barn, his memories and his dreams of wealth. He had failed miserably. The inheritance had turned to ashes, and the image of his mother being carried away by a legendary tiger would be a curse that would haunt him forever. What remained now? Only the infernal heat of the fire and the icy cold of his own solitude and failure. The night, which should have been his ally, had delivered him to a fate far worse than death. And the legend of the albino tiger, which he thought was just a fairy tale, had just rewritten his own story. The farmer stood there, a statue of fury and despair, the useless weight of the shotgun trembling in his hands. The roar of the fire, once a symphony of victory, was now the deafening sound of his own ruin. The infernal heat of the burning barn licked at his back, but the cold that invaded him was far deeper, an ice that settled in his soul. The image of the albino tiger, a white streak against the red-orange hell, disappearing into the forest's darkness with his mother, etched itself into his mind like a curse. There was no longer the cruel smile, only a grimace of disbelief and hatred. His plan, so meticulously orchestrated, undone by a creature he considered a mere fairy tale. The inheritance, which he already felt in his hands, slipped like sand, now transformed into ashes and smoke. He had failed, miserably, and the failure was public, witnessed by the night itself and by the legend he had dared to challenge. As the farmer drowned in his own misery, the albino tiger, with the old mother still leaning on its flank, moved with silent grace through the dense forest foliage. The night air, cool and damp, was a welcome relief after the suffocating heat of the barn. The smoke, still lingering, diminished with each step, replaced by the earthy scent of the woods and the sweet aroma of night-blooming flowers. The old woman, coughing and gasping, felt her body exhausted, every muscle protesting, but a strange strength propelled her. It wasn't just the tiger's strength guiding her, but the adrenaline of the escape itself, the disbelief of being alive. Her cloudy eyes tried to adjust to the darkness, but it was the constant, protective presence of the beast that guided her. She could barely believe what her eyes saw, what her body felt. Her son had condemned her to death, and a legendary beast had saved her. The world's logic crumbled around her. The tiger did not stop until it found a small clearing, a hidden nook beneath the dense canopy of an ancient oak. With a soft growl, it lowered itself, allowing the old woman to slide from its support. She fell onto the soft ground of dry leaves, her body trembling with exhaustion and shock. The smoke still scratched at her throat, but the pure forest air began to clear her lungs. The tiger, its blue eyes fixed on her, showed no ferocity, only calm vigilance. It sat at a respectful distance, its massive body forming a protective barrier against the outside world. The old woman, finally safe from the fire and her son's cruelty, felt her initial fear of the animal give way to deep admiration. How could such a wild creature be so gentle? Her heart, once constricted by pain and abandonment, now felt a complex mix of gratitude, awe, and a strange peace. She was alive, and she was with the legend. Back at the farm, the barn was now a smoldering carcass, its last flames licking at the night sky before surrendering to total consumption. The farmer, still standing in the same spot, the shotgun hanging from his numb hands, watched the destruction. The sinister glow of the fire illuminated his contorted face, revealing tears of rage and frustration that streamed down his soot-stained cheeks. There was no longer the warmth of the promised inheritance, only the literal heat of the ashes and the icy cold of his own solitude. The forest, once a silent backdrop, now seemed to mock him with its silence, a reminder of the tiger's and his mother's escape. He had lost everything: his reputation, his fortune, and perhaps what remained of his own humanity. The legend of the albino tiger was not just a tale. It was a living force that had come to correct a wrong, and in doing so had undone a man's life. Night advanced, and with it the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. For the farmer, only emptiness remained, the echo of the fire and the haunting image of the white beast. For the old mother, the journey was just beginning, a new life alongside a creature that defied understanding, an unexpected guardian in a world that had abandoned her. The fate of both now was intertwined with the legend, an uncertain path that stretched beyond the flames and the forest's darkness. What did the future hold for the woman rescued by the legend? And what would happen to the man who dared to challenge nature's own justice? The story, far from ending, was merely gaining a new and unpredictable chapter, written not by a man's hand, but by the silent pause of a myth. The farmer, immersed in fury and despair, watched the last embers of the barn die out, taking with them not only the wood and hay, but also every fragment of his planned future. The smell of smoke and destruction permeated the air, a poignant reminder of his defeat. The shotgun, which once promised power, was now a useless weight in his numb hands, a symbol of his impotence. His eyes, once filled with a calculating gleam, now reflected the emptiness of a ruined soul. The image of the white beast, carrying his mother into the forest's darkness, replayed in his mind like a lucid nightmare, a personal affront, a mockery from nature itself. He had been deceived, not by a man, but by a myth. Night advanced, and with it the cold of dawn began to bite the farmer's exposed skin. But the external cold was minuscule compared to the ice settling in his heart. The inheritance, the freedom, the life he so coveted, all had vanished like smoke. All that remained was the desolation of a ruined farm and the deafening echo of his own failure. The rage that once propelled him now transformed into a slow poison, corroding his sanity. He could not accept it. He could not allow an animal, a legend, to destroy everything he had planned. Vengeance, a dark seed, began to germinate in the arid soil of his despair. The tiger had not only ruined him, it had stolen his mother, his property, his very reason for being. And for that, it would pay. As madness settled in the farmer's mind, the old mother in her secret clearing began to feel the relief of safety. The tiger, sitting in its silent majesty, watched her with those blue eyes that seemed to penetrate the soul. The smoke-induced cough lessened, and the fresh forest air filled her lungs, bringing with it the aromas of damp earth and wild life. She was exhausted, every bone in her body protesting, but there was a strange peace, a serenity she hadn't felt in years. Beside the beast, she felt safer than she had ever felt beside her own son. The old woman extended a trembling hand, not to touch the tiger, but to feel the texture of the dry leaves beneath her fingers. Her mind, still clouded by shock and age, began to process the magnitude of what had happened. Her son, whom she had given birth to and raised, had abandoned her to die. And a wild creature, a being of legends, had rescued her. The world she knew had turned upside down. The tiger, as if sensing her confusion, let out a low growl, almost a purr, and moved a little closer, resting its head on its front paws. Its blue eyes never left her. It was constant vigilance, a silent promise of protection. The old woman, with a sigh that carried the weight of a lifetime of suffering and now of a miracle, finally managed to close her eyes. Sleep, which had eluded her for so long, came as a balm, cradled by the distant sound of crickets and the imposing presence of the tiger. She slept, not in the comfort of a bed, but in the safety of a legend, under the protective mantle of a creature that defied all logic. At dawn, the first sunbeams filtered through the dense tree canopy, painting the clearing with golden patches. The old woman awoke, feeling strangely refreshed. The tiger was still there, a white and imposing mass, but now with its eyes half closed, perhaps dozing. Hunger, a sensation that shock had suppressed, began to make itself known. But where to find food in the forest, and where to go? She was at the mercy of the beast, and of a completely unknown destiny. Back at the farm, the rising sun revealed the full extent of the devastation. The barn was now a pile of ashes and charred beams, a monument to ambition and failure. The farmer was still there, standing, the shotgun fallen at his feet. His face was streaked with soot and dried tears, his eyes bloodshot. He had not slept. The night had been a torment of dark images and thoughts. Rage had solidified into a cold, dangerous determination. He could not simply let his mother go with the tiger. He could not allow the legend to win. It wasn't just the inheritance. It was his pride, his very existence, that had been crushed. He crouched, picking up the shotgun again, feeling the familiar weight of the metal in his hands. There was no more hesitation. There was only one certainty. He would find the tiger. He would reclaim his mother, and he would make the beast pay for every piece of his life that had been destroyed. With a final look at the smoldering ruins, the farmer turned to the forest, the same forest that had swallowed his mother and the tiger. His steps were heavy but determined. He had no clear plan, only a thirst for revenge and a distorted conviction that what was his, he would reclaim. The forest, which for the old mother was a refuge, for him became a hunting ground, a labyrinth where he hoped to confront the legend and rewrite his own ending. The hunt had begun, and the fate of all involved was now hanging by a thread between the ferocity of a man and the majesty of a myth. Danger lurked in every shadow, and the future, uncertain and grim, awaited his next move. The forest swallowed the farmer. Each step was an echo of his fury. Each dry leaf under his boots, a crackle that seemed to mock his presence. The sun, which outside already bathed the ruined farm, could barely penetrate the dense tree canopy within, leaving the ground in an eternal twilight. His eyes, red and swollen from the sleepless night, scanned the terrain for any sign, any trace that would lead him to the white beast and the woman he considered his property. The shotgun, once a useless weight, was now an extension of his arm, a symbol of his murderous intent. He was no tiger hunter. He was a farmer, accustomed to slaughtering livestock, not legends. But rage propelled him, a brute force that obscured fear and logic. The smell of smoke, still clinging to his clothes, mingled with the damp aroma of earth and decaying leaves, a constant reminder of his defeat and what he had lost. The inheritance, the freedom, the life he had meticulously planned, all had been torn from him by an animal, and by his mother who dared to survive. Every snapping branch, every moving shadow seemed like a spectre. The forest, which he had always seen as a resource, was now a hostile labyrinth, its whispers seemingly conspiring against him. He stumbled over exposed roots, scratched himself on thorny bushes, but did not stop. The image of the tiger, white and imposing, carrying his mother into the darkness, was a torment that replayed in his mind, fueling his thirst for revenge. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about control, about the humiliation of being defeated by a wild creature. He could not allow the legend to win. Meanwhile, in the secret clearing, the old mother opened her eyes to a new world. The sun filtered in golden rays, warming the dry, leaf-strewn ground. The pure forest air filled her lungs, and the smoke-induced cough had diminished to a mere scratch in her throat. The albino tiger, an imposing mass of white fur, lay a few meters from her, its blue eyes half-closed yet still vigilant. Hunger, a sensation that shock had suppressed, now made itself known, an uncomfortable emptiness in her stomach. She sat up, feeling her aching muscles protest, but with a strange sense of peace. Beside the beast, she felt safer than she had ever felt beside her own son. The irony was cruel, but undeniable. Her son had condemned her to death, and a legendary creature had saved her. The world she knew had turned upside down, and she was now at the mercy of a completely unknown destiny. The tiger, as if sensing her restlessness, fully opened its eyes, its blue eyes, deep and wise, fixed on her. It let out a low growl, almost an invitation, and slowly rose, its massive body moving with surprising grace. It looked at the old woman, then at the dense forest foliage, as if inviting her to follow. The old woman hesitated for a moment. Where would it lead her? To safety or to perdition? But hunger was a cruel master, and trust in the tiger, however illogical, had taken root in her heart. She rose with difficulty, leaning on a nearby trunk. "Where are we going, my guardian?" she whispered, knowing the animal wouldn't understand but feeling the need to speak. The tiger did not wait for her answer. It turned and began to move silently through the forest, its steps almost inaudible. The old woman followed, her cloudy eyes trying to keep pace with the white figure that moved like a ghost among the trees. With each step, she felt the vulnerability of her age and the immensity of the forest, but the tiger's presence was an invisible shield, a promise of protection against unknown dangers. They walked for a time the old woman couldn't measure. The sun climbed in the sky, but the forest remained a sanctuary of shadows and filtered light. The tiger guided her along paths that seemed to exist only for it, avoiding obstacles with an ease the old woman could barely imitate. Hunger gnawed, and thirst began to scratch at her throat. Suddenly the tiger stopped. It stood at the edge of a small stream, its crystal-clear waters murmuring softly over the stones. It bent down and drank, then looked at the old woman, as if inviting her to do the same. With a sigh of relief, she knelt and drank the fresh water, feeling it wash the dust and fear from her throat. It was a small miracle, a simple but vital provision. Far away, but drawing closer with each step, the farmer continued his relentless search. He had found a trail, not of the tiger, but of his mother. A torn piece of fabric caught on a bush, a fragment of the shawl she wore. A dark flame of hope ignited in his eyes. They weren't so far. The forest, which once seemed to mock him, now seemed to reveal its secrets one by one. But with each meter he advanced, the forest seemed to grow denser, more treacherous. The sounds of nature, once mere background noise, now seemed to intensify, each rustle of leaves, each bird's song, an alert, a warning. He felt the forest's eyes on him, an invisible presence that judged him. The rage that propelled him began to mix with a subtle fear, a recognition that he was in a territory where the rules were different, where legend was law. He didn't know what he would do when he found the tiger. Shoot? Try to negotiate? His mind was clouded by obsession. He only knew he couldn't give up. His life, His reputation, everything depended on him reversing what had happened. The tiger had stolen his inheritance, his mother, his very sanity, and he would make the beast pay. In the stream's clearing, the old mother, refreshed by the water, watched the tiger. It was lying down again, but its blue eyes were fixed in the direction from which they had come. There was a tension in its body, a vigilance the old woman hadn't noticed before. It was as if it sensed something, a disturbance in the air, an imminent danger. The forest's silence, once calming, now seemed charged with a grim expectation. The old woman felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the cold. It was the feeling of being hunted. The peace she had found was unraveling, replaced by a familiar fear. Her son. He would come, she knew, and the tiger, her guardian, was aware of it too. The forest, which had welcomed her, now prepared for a confrontation, a clash between a man's cruelty and a legend's protective majesty. The fate of all, once again, hung in the balance, and the next chapter would be written with fury and courage under the watchful eye of wild nature. In the stream's clearing, the air that once felt like a balm now grew dense, almost palpable, with the imminence of something terrible. The old mother, refreshed by the cool water, watched the albino tiger. Its blue eyes, once half closed in vigilant repose, were now fully open, fixed in the direction from which they had come. There was a tension in its massive body, a rigidity the old woman hadn't noticed before. Every muscle seemed poised, every white hair bristling with a perception beyond human understanding. It wasn't just a disturbance in the air, it was a presence, a threat approaching, step by step, through the dense foliage. A cold shiver ran down the old woman's spine, not from the wind, but from a chilling certainty that settled in her chest. Her son, he would come, she knew. The momentary peace she had found beside the legendary beast dissolved like smoke, replaced by a familiar fear, but now tinged with a new and strange determination. The tiger, her unexpected guardian, let out a low growl, a guttural sound that vibrated through the ground and in the old woman's chest. It was not a sound of anger, but of alert, of warning. It rose slowly, without taking its eyes off the forest, positioning its imposing body between the old woman and the direction of danger. It was a living shield, a wall of fur and muscle against the approaching cruelty. The old woman felt a wave of emotion. Gratitude, yes, but also a silent fury. Her own flesh and blood had abandoned her to death, while a wild creature, a legend, protected her. The irony was a bitter poison, but also a strength. She was no longer the helpless old woman awaiting death in the burning barn. She was the woman who had survived, who had been chosen by a myth. And now she would not allow her son to destroy this new and strange existence. She moved, with difficulty, closer to the tiger, placing a trembling hand on its flank. Its skin was warm and soft, a contrast to the cold metal of the shotgun she knew her son carried. Far away, but drawing closer with each step, the farmer continued his relentless search. The trail of his mother's shawl had become a beacon in the darkness of his obsession. Each piece of fabric, each crushed leaf, each broken branch was a confirmation that he was on the right path. But the forest seemed to conspire against him. Branches whipped at his face, exposed roots made him stumble, and the silence, once merely the absence of sound, now seemed like a chorus of mocking whispers. He was exhausted, his body ached, but his mind was ablaze, fueled by a toxic mix of rage, humiliation, and a distorted conviction that what was his, he would reclaim. Damn old woman. Damn animal, he snarled to himself, his voice hoarse and raspy. You won't steal from me. You won't steal what's rightfully mine. The shotgun in his hands weighed like lead, but it was also the only thing that gave him a sense of control. He was no hunter, but fury transformed him into something more primitive, more dangerous. He imagined the tiger, white and imposing, and his mother, sitting beside it, as if they had swapped roles, as if the beast were her son and he, the monster. This image drove him even further into madness. Suddenly, a sound. A low but deep growl that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. It was the tiger. It was close, very close. The farmer stopped abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear he had suppressed with rage now threatened to overwhelm him. But obsession was stronger. He gripped the shotgun, sweat trickling down his hands. He crept forward, each step calculated, each dry leaf under his boots a deafening crunch in his own ears. The sunlight, which barely penetrated the tree canopy, seemed to focus on a spot ahead, revealing a clearing. He forced his way through a tangle of thorny bushes, tearing his shirt and scratching his skin. And then he saw it. The scene that haunted his nightmares and fueled his fury was there, before his bloodshot eyes. At the edge of a crystal-clear stream, the albino tiger stood, imposing, its blue eyes fixed on him with icy intensity. And beside the beast, his mother. She was not bound, nor frightened. She sat, her hand on its flank, looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face, a mixture of defiance and a strange serenity. The farmer stopped, the shotgun raised, aimed at the surreal scene. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The image was so powerful, so unreal, that for an instant he doubted his own sanity. The tiger, the legendary guardian, and his mother, the old woman he had condemned to death. They were there together, defying him. The tiger's growl intensified, transforming into a deep snarl that echoed through the forest, a clear warning, a sonic barrier between him and what he wanted to destroy. The old mother, in turn, tightened her hand on the tiger's flank, her eyes fixed on his, not wavering. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next move. The confrontation had arrived, and the fate of all now no longer hung by a thread, but was about to be severed. The air in the clearing grew so dense it seemed to crush the farmer's lungs. His eyes, bloodshot and clouded by exhaustion and fury, fixed on the surreal scene before him. There she was, his mother, the old woman he had condemned to death, sitting beside the legendary beast, the albino tiger. There was no fear on her face, only a disturbing stillness, a serenity he had never seen before. And her hand, that aged hand that had once cradled him, was now resting on the tiger's flank as if seeking comfort, as if seeking protection in it. The image was a blow stronger than any fist, a betrayal deeper than any knife. What was this? An unholy alliance? A nightmare that refused to end? The inheritance, the freedom he so coveted, all dissolved before his eyes, not into smoke, but into a grotesque and unacceptable reality. The tiger, the animal he had seen as a thief, an obstacle, now seemed to mock him with its piercing blue eyes. A guardian of a truth the farmer refused to accept. "Mother, what is this?" The farmer's voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper, but laden with a disbelief that quickly transformed into simmering hatred. He couldn't process it. His already fragile mind began to fragment. It wasn't just the tiger that had robbed him, it was his own mother. She had chosen the beast. She had chosen the forest. She had abandoned him just as he had abandoned her. The irony was a poison that burned in his veins. The tiger let out a deeper snarl, a sound that vibrated through the earth and in the farmer's chest, a primal warning that seemed to tear through the veil of civility he still tried to maintain. It was the voice of nature, pure and uncompromising, defending what was its own. The old mother, in turn, did not move. Her eyes, once so full of sadness and resignation, now gleamed with a cold determination, fixed on her son's eyes. There was no plea, no fear, only the realization of an insurmountable abyss between them. The farmer raised the shotgun a little higher, the barrel pointing towards the center of the clearing. His breathing was ragged, sweat streamed down his face, mixing with dirt and scratches. He felt the weapon's weight, the promise of power it represented. He was no hunter, but fury had transformed him. He didn't know whom he hated more at that moment, the tiger that had ruined his plans, or the mother who seemed to have embraced her destiny with the beast. You'll pay for this," he screamed, his voice finally finding its strength, but distorted by madness. "Both of you, you'll pay." The old mother tightened her hand on the tiger's flank, a subtle gesture yet laden with meaning. She didn't need words. The tiger understood, its muscles tensed, every white hair bristling in maximum alert. It was not just an animal, it was the incarnation of an ancestral force, a guardian of a balance that man had tried to break. The farmer, blinded by rage and humiliation, did not see the warning in the tiger's blue eyes, nor the unwavering resolve in his mother's gaze. He only saw the lost inheritance, the frustrated plan, the mockery in every leaf that rustled in the wind. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the forest, a brutal sound that tore through the clearing silence and air. A flash of fire and smoke erupted from the shotgun's barrel. But the tiger was no longer where he had aimed. In a move that defied speed and logic, the legendary beast had moved, not to flee, but to attack. The shot hit the ground, kicking up dirt and dry leaves mere inches from where the tiger had been. The farmer's mistake, his haste, was his first and perhaps last fatal error. The tiger's snarl transformed into a guttural roar, a sound that sent birds flying in panic and small animals scattering to hide. The albino tiger, the living legend, advanced. It was not a disorderly advance, but a calculated movement, every muscle propelling its massive body with deadly grace. The old mother watched, not with fear, but with a strange sense of justice. She had survived her son's cruelty, and now nature, in its most majestic and wild form, was about to exact its price. The farmer, with an empty shotgun and shock etched on his face, barely had time to register the white blur that launched itself upon him. The confrontation was no longer a stalemate. It was a sentence, and the forest, silent witness to centuries of life and death, awaited the outcome. The shotgun's report, a dry thunderclap in the forest's stillness, was the last note of his old life. The farmer, paralyzed by shock and disbelief, saw the white blur not as an animal, but as an avalanche of destiny. The shot, meant to take the life he so despised, had only grazed the earth, a mute testament to his blind and ineffectual fury. And now the legend, the spirit of the forest he had tried to profane, was upon him. There was no time for screams nor for pleas. The tiger's speed was the very essence of predation, a powerful white blur that struck him with the force of lightning. The impact threw him to the ground, the empty shotgun flying from his numb hands onto the damp grass. The air was expelled from his lungs in a muffled groan, and the world spun in a whirlwind of dirt, leaves, and the tiger's wild scent. The claws were not just weapons, they were extensions of the forest itself, sharpened by nature, relentless in their justice. They did not seek a quick kill, but a lesson, a punishment. The farmer felt the pressure, the tearing of his clothes, the acute pain radiating through his body. It wasn't death that frightened him in that instant, but the humiliation, the absolute powerlessness before the beast he had underestimated, that he had tried to destroy. His eyes, once full of hatred and greed, now reflected a primordial terror, a belated recognition of the force he had challenged. The old mother watched, not with the sadistic joy her son expected, but with a somber stillness, an acceptance. She had seen the malice in his eyes for too long, felt the weight of his cruel ambition. Now, the forest was collecting its debt. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep and melancholic understanding that the cycle, finally, was closing. The hand that once rested on the tiger's flank now clutched her own chest, feeling the strong beats of a heart that had been rescued from darkness. The tiger was not a merciless killer, but a judge. It did not seek annihilation, but the restoration of balance. The snarls that emanated from its throat were not just sounds of fury, but the voice of nature, reminding man of his place, his insignificance before wild grandeur. The farmer tried to struggle, tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat, suffocated by fear and dust. He saw the tiger's blue eyes, no longer icy, but burning with an intensity that seemed to scorch his soul. In those eyes, he saw not just a predator, but the reflection of his own cruelty, magnified and returned to him with full force. The struggle was brief, but intense. The tiger, with terrifying precision, immobilized the farmer, not to kill him immediately, but to let him feel the weight of his own insignificance, the terror of vulnerability. The farmer's body trembled, not just from pain, but from an overwhelming realization. The inheritance, the money, the freedom he so coveted, all vanished before the reality of his own mortality. He was not the master, the predator, he was the prey. Then the tiger took a step back, but not before leaving its mark, an indelible reminder of who the true sovereign of that land was. The farmer lay there, prostrate, his body aching, his breath ragged, his eyes fixed on the grey sky that barely filtered through the trees. He was not dead, but he was broken. Fury had transformed into a glacial emptiness, obsession into a paralyzing dread. His mind, once so full of plans and calculations, was now a chaos of fragmented images, dominated by the vision of those blue eyes. The old mother rose, her movements slow but steady. She walked to her son, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. The sorrow of a mother who saw her own flesh and blood lost to darkness. She looked at him, fallen, humiliated, and in his eyes there was no longer the gleam of inheritance, only the shadow of what he had become. The tiger in turn remained by her side, an imposing presence, a silent guardian, its blue eyes fixed on the farmer for a final instant, a warning, a sentence. The forest, which had held its breath, now seemed to let out a collective sigh, a murmur of leaves and wind that announced the end of one era and the beginning of another. The confrontation had ended, and the old mother, with the albino tiger by her side, was no longer the victim. She was the survivor, the witness, and now the guardian of a secret that would forever change the destiny of those lands. The farmer, in his defeat, had, unknowingly, freed his mother to a new and unpredictable existence. The farmer lay there, not dead, but something far worse. His body, once propelled by fury and greed, was now just a trembling heap of flesh and bones on the damp earth. The air, which he had tried to monopolize with his shouts of hatred, seemed to have been sucked from his lungs, leaving him in a suffocating silence. The physical pain was intense, a deep tearing from where the tiger's claws had met his skin, but it was the internal pain that was dismantling him. Humiliation was an icy poison, more potent than any wound. He, the man who saw himself as master, as predator, had been reduced to a pathetic prey, his meticulous plan undone by a beast and by his own mother. His eyes, still fixed on the grey sky, filtering through the treetops, no longer saw the promise of inheritance, but the indifferent vastness of a world that had rejected him. The forest, once a mere obstacle to be cleared, now seemed a silent tribunal, its leaves whispering the final sentence. Every rustle, every dancing shadow was a reminder of his insignificance, of his madness. The shotgun, his extension of power and control, lay a few meters away, a useless object, a symbol of his impotence. He could not move, could not scream, only breathe in short, painful gasps as terror rooted itself in every fiber of his being. The old mother, with slow and deliberate steps, approached, There was no haste in her movements, only a gravity that seemed to weigh on the air. The albino tiger. A mountain of muscle and white fur remained by her side, its sapphire blue eyes fixed on the farmer, with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. It was an image that would be etched in the man's mind forever. The mother he had tried to burn alive, and the beast he had tried to kill, united in an unbreakable alliance, a living monument to his own ruin. She stopped a few steps from him, her shadow falling over his prostrate body. There was no anger in her gaze, nor triumph, only a deep sadness, an ancestral weariness that seemed to have accumulated for generations. She saw him, not as the son she once loved, but as the empty shell of a man consumed by darkness. The inheritance, the money, the freedom he so coveted, all vanished before the reality of his own mortality. Of his corrupted soul, he was not the master, the predator, he was the prey. You won't. Leave me here. The farmer's voice came out as a scratch in his throat, a desperate whisper that barely broke the silence. He tried to reach out, a pathetic gesture of plea, but his muscles did not respond. The mother did not respond with words. Her eyes only deepened in melancholy. She knelt slowly, not to help him, but to pick something from the ground beside him. It was a small, faded photograph, an image of a smiling boy and a young woman, with eyes full of hope. She was the mother, and the boy, once innocent, was him. She held the photo for a moment, her wrinkled fingers tracing her son's face in his youth, before greed and hatred transformed him. A sigh escaped her lips, a sound that carried the weight of a lifetime of disillusionment. The tiger let out a low growl, almost inaudible, a murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was not a growl of threat, but of warning, of finality. It was nature reminding man of his place, his insignificance before wild grandeur. The mother rose, the photograph clutched in her hand. She looked at her son one last time, and in those eyes the farmer saw the end of any bond, of any hope of redemption. She was no longer his mother, the woman he could manipulate, whom he could abandon. She was something else now, a part of the forest, a guardian of a balance he had tried to break. With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, she turned. The tiger, like a white shadow, moved with her, its steps silent on the grass. They did not look back. The forest, which had held its breath, now seemed to let out a collective sigh, a murmur of leaves and wind that announced the end of one era and the beginning of another. The farmer lay there prostrate, his body aching, his breath ragged, his eyes fixed on the spot where they had disappeared. He was not dead, but he was broken. Fury had transformed into a glacial emptiness, obsession into a paralyzing dread. His mind, once so full of plans and calculations, was now a chaos of fragmented images, dominated by the vision of those blue eyes and the silhouette of his mother, who had abandoned him not to death but to the wild. The inheritance, the burned barn, all seemed a distant dream, a cruel illusion. He was alone. Completely alone, and the forest which he had so despised was now his only witness, his only judge. The confrontation had ended, and the old mother, with the albino tiger by her side, was no longer the victim. She was the survivor, the witness, and now the guardian of a secret that would forever change the destiny of those lands. The farmer, in his defeat, had, unknowingly, freed his mother to a new and unpredictable existence, while he himself remained trapped in his own prison of despair and regret. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the darkness of night began to swallow the clearing, and with it the farmer and his shattered dreams. The darkness of night did not arrive like a soft veil, but like an avalanche of shadows, swallowing the clearing where the farmer lay. The cold, once merely an uncomfortable sensation, now clung to him, penetrating his bones, an icy reminder of his vulnerability. Each gasp was a tear in his lungs, each attempt to move a muscle, a sharp pang that immobilized him further. He was trapped, not just by physical pain, but by an invisible web of terror and despair. His eyes, once filled with fury and greed, now reflected only dread. The grey sky had given way to an indifferent, starry blanket, and the treetops transformed into menacing silhouettes, dancing to the rhythm of a wind that whispered his name. The sounds of the forest, once muffled by his own delirium, now became amplified. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a branch, each distant howl of a coyote was a premonition of danger, a macabre melody for his imminent end. The shotgun, his extension of power and control, lay a few meters away, unreachable, a useless object that mocked his impotence. He, the man who considered himself the predator, the master of all he surveyed, had been reduced to the most pathetic prey, abandoned to the mercy of a world he had tried to subjugate. The irony was a poison that burned more than any wound. The inheritance, the word echoed in his mind, empty, devoid of any meaning. For that, he had betrayed his blood, tried to murder his own mother. For that, he had transformed into a monster. And now, he had nothing. Neither the inheritance, nor his mother, nor even dignity. The image from the photograph of that smiling boy haunted him. Who was that? It wasn't him. He had died long ago, replaced by this broken creature, trembling on the cold ground, awaiting whatever the night might bring. The tiger. It hadn't killed him. Why? To let him suffer. So the forest could consume him slowly, piece by piece. It was a punishment far crueler than instant death. The farmer's mind was a chaos of fragmented images, dominated by the vision of those blue eyes and the silhouette of his mother, who had abandoned him not to death, but to the wild. He was alone, completely alone. And the forest, which he had so despised, was now his only witness, his only judge. As darkness deepened over the farmer, the old mother walked. Her steps, once hesitant and marked by age, were now firm, almost light, as if the earth beneath her feet welcomed her. The albino tiger, a majestic and silent presence, moved by her side, its sapphire blue eyes scanning the growing darkness with ancestral vigilance. There was no fear in her, only a deep stillness, an acceptance. The forest, which once represented danger and the unknown, was now a refuge, a sanctuary. Every tree, every bush, every nocturnal sound seemed to embrace her, whispering ancient secrets. She felt the earth beneath her feet, the breeze on her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. Free. Free from the chains of greed, the weight of disillusionment, the shadow of a son who was lost. The photograph of her son, still clutched in her hand, was the last link to a life she had left behind. She looked at it again, the faded image of the innocent boy. A solitary tear traced a path down her wrinkled face, not from sadness for what was lost, but from mourning for what her son had become. She did not hate him. She only felt a searing pain for the soul he had sold. The tiger growled softly, almost inaudibly, as if understanding, and rubbed its head against her hand. It was a gesture of comfort, of loyalty. She was not alone. She had a new companion, a guardian, and perhaps a new purpose. To protect this place, this wildlife, this balance her son had tried to destroy. Night deepened, and with it, the separation between two worlds. On one side, the farmer, a broken man abandoned to his own darkness, his greed transforming into an endless nightmare, awaiting a dawn that might never come for him. On the other, the mother, a reborn woman, finding peace and power in the wildness that once frightened her, her steps guided by a new light, a new hope. The burned barn, the inheritance, all of it was now just smoke in memory, a trace of a life that had been consumed by the fire of ambition. The forest, in its silent wisdom, had collected its debt. And the price was a man's soul and a woman's liberation to a destiny no one could have foreseen. The cycle, finally, was complete, and a new dawn awaited, but not for everyone. The sounds of the forest, once muffled by his own delirium, now became amplified. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a branch, each distant howl of a coyote was a premonition of danger, a macabre melody for his imminent end. The shotgun, his extension of power and control, lay a few meters away, unreachable, a useless object that mocked his impotence. He, the man who considered himself the predator, the master of all he surveyed, had been reduced to the most pathetic prey, abandoned to the mercy of a world he had tried to subjugate. The irony was a poison that burned more than any wound. The photograph of her son, still clutched in her hand, was the last link to a life she had left behind. She looked at it again, the faded image of the innocent boy. A solitary tear traced a path down her wrinkled face, not from sadness for what was lost, but from mourning for what her son had become. She did not hate him. She only felt a searing pain for the soul he had sold. The tiger growled softly, almost inaudibly, as if understanding, and rubbed its head against her hand. It was a gesture of comfort, of loyalty. She was not alone. She had a new companion, a guardian, and perhaps a new purpose. To protect this place, this wildlife, this balance her son had tried to destroy. The farmer, however, was not concerned with dawns. His body trembled uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a primordial fear that chilled him to the bone. The smell of his own blood, mixed with the damp odor of earth and decaying leaves, seemed to attract something. He listened. First, a distant rustle, then a closer snap of a branch, and then a low, guttural growl that was not the tiger's. It was harsher. Hungrier, his wide eyes tried to pierce the darkness but found only dancing shadows. A pair of yellow eyes gleamed in the gloom a few meters away, then another pair and another. They were not the tiger's wise blue eyes, but wild, predatory eyes that watched him with cruel patience. A howl cut through the air, not solitary as before, but answered by others, closer, forming a chilling chorus that echoed through the forest. A pack, wolves or coyotes, he couldn't tell, but he knew what it meant. He was the prey, wounded, immobile, abandoned. The first animal emerged from the shadows, a grey wolf with matted fur and eyes fixed on him. Its snout contorted, revealing sharp teeth, and a low growl escaped its throat. Others followed, circling him slowly, moving like ghosts in the darkness. The farmer tried to scream, but his voice failed, a mere hoarse wheeze. He tried to drag himself, but the pain paralyzed him. He was at their mercy, an unexpected feast for the inhabitants of the night. The inheritance, the burned barn, the life he had planned, all vanished before the brutal reality of his imminent death. He had sought death for his mother, and now death found him, not by the hands of a man, but by the claws and teeth of the nature he had so despised. The forest finally collected its debt. The forest finally collected its debt. The first wolf, the one with matted fur and amber eyes, took the decisive step. There was no haste, only the inevitability of a hungry predator. A louder, sharper snarl tore through the night's silence, and it was the signal. The pack moved as a single shadow, a grey, hungry wave that launched itself upon the farmer. He had no time to scream again, nor to think. Pain erupted in his body like a million knives, tearing flesh and bone. Muffled screams escaped his throat, mingling with the snarls and howls of the animals. The smell of his own blood, warm and metallic, filled his nostrils, and he felt the cold of the ground beneath his back mix with the damp heat of the mouths that tore at him. His wide eyes caught flashes of sharp teeth, of wild fur, of a primal fury he had underestimated and provoked. In his final seconds, the farmer's mind found no peace, no redemption. The image of the burning barn, his trapped mother, the satisfied smile on his face, swirled in a vortex of horror. He had wished for death, for destruction, and now it was he who was consumed, not by the fire he lit, but by the savagery he despised. Every bite, every tug was a punishment, a reminder of his arrogance, his cruelty, the inheritance, the power, the life he had planned, all disintegrated in a final scream of agony, a sound the forest absorbed without a trace of pity. The silence that followed, broken only by the sounds of the pack feeding, was nature's answer. The farmer had become part of the land he so coveted, a feast for the beings he considered inferior. His story ended not with a lament, but with the sound of wildlife reclaiming what was its own. Far away, beneath the dense canopy of trees, the old mother continued her journey. A shiver ran down her spine, a premonition that was not of fear, but of a conclusion. The albino tiger, walking by her side, paused for an instant, its ears turning back, its blue eyes fixed on some invisible distance. A low growl, almost a murmur, escaped its throat, different from the hungry snarls of the pack. It was a sound of recognition, of a cycle closing. The mother felt the change in the air, a lightness, as if an old weight had finally been lifted. She didn't know the details, but she understood the essence. The forest had acted. Justice, relentless and silent, had been served. She clutched her son's photograph in her hand once more. The image of the innocent boy now seemed even more distant, a ghost of a past that no longer existed. The tear that fell was no longer one of mourning for a lost soul, but of serene acceptance. He had made his choices, and nature in its wisdom had responded. Her steps, once guided by flight, were now propelled by a new purpose. She was not just surviving, she was living, and living for something greater than herself. The forest, with its secrets and pulsating life, was no longer a place of exile, but a home, a sanctuary she felt the need to protect. The tiger, her silent guardian, seemed to read her thoughts, moving in perfect synchronicity with her. They walked along paths unmarked on any human map, guided by intuition and the forest's ancestral wisdom. The stars above seemed brighter, and the night breeze carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and wildlife. She felt the forest's energy flow through her, a force that rejuvenated her, connecting her to something deep and eternal. Her son's greed, the fire that consumed the barn, the inheritance he so desired, all of it seemed small, insignificant before the vastness and majesty of nature. She was the guardian, the witness, the silent voice of a world many had forgotten. Her new life was not one of luxury or power, but of a far greater wealth, freedom, peace, and connection to the sacred. The photograph now was not a link to the past, but a reminder of what she had left behind and what she now defended. Dawn approached, but for her, a new era had already begun, an era where the mother, the woman the world had forgotten, became a living legend in the depths of the forest, guided by an albino tiger and the wisdom of the earth. The cycle of destruction had ended, and the cycle of protection and renewal had begun. Dawn did not arrive gently for the mother. It burst forth, an explosion of colors and sounds that tore through the veil of night, not with the delicacy of a new day, but with the force of a revelation. Golden rays pierced the dense canopy, painting the leaves of vibrant green and revealing a world that, under darkness, had seemed only a whisper. The air, once cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant blood, now filled with the sweet fragrance of dew and the promise of life. She felt the sun's warmth on her wrinkled face, a warmth that was not just physical, but seemed to rekindle something within her. The albino tiger, her silent guardian, sat beside her, its blue eyes reflecting the sunrise, as deep and ancient as the forest itself. There was no longer the urgency of flight, nor the weight of grief. The photograph of her son, which she still held, now seemed an artifact from another life, a reminder of what she had been and what he had become. She put it in her pocket, not to forget, but to remember the price of greed and the redemption nature offered. Her steps, once hesitant, were now firm, guided by an intuition she had never known she possessed. The forest was no longer a labyrinth of dangers, but a map of life, each trail, each stream, each clearing a new chapter to be explored. She felt the earth beneath her feet, the pulsating energy rising from its roots, connecting her to everything around her. It was a symbiosis, a fusion. She was no longer an intruder, but an integral part of that ecosystem, a witness and a guardian. The tension, though no longer one of immediate fear, persisted in a different way. It was the tension of responsibility, the weight of a new purpose. The cycle of destruction had ended, yes, but the cycle of protection and renewal that was beginning brought its own challenges. The forest, in its majesty, was a sanctuary, but the outside world, the world she had left behind, was a place of oblivion and greed. She knew that her son's disappearance, the burned barn, her own absence, would not go unnoticed forever. Human curiosity, the search for answers, the insatiable need to control and possess would eventually reach the limits of that refuge. And when it did, she would be ready, not with the fury of a victim, but with the resolute stillness of one who had found her place and her power. The tiger growled softly, a sound that seemed to emerge from the earth's depths, and rubbed its head against her hand. It was a pact, a promise. They were two beings from different worlds, united by an improbable destiny, forged in the fire of betrayal and reborn in the ashes of ambition. The legend of the albino tiger, once a whisper among the elders, would now gain a new dimension, a new guardian. She found herself watching a deer fawn hidden among the bushes, its large, curious eyes fixed on her. There was no fear in the animal's gaze, only an instinctive acceptance. The mother felt a wave of protection, a visceral need to safeguard that innocent life, just as the tiger had saved her. Her new life was not one of solitude, but of a deep connection to the web of life. Days would turn into weeks, weeks into months. She would learn the forest's secrets, the language of the winds, the song of the birds, the distant roar of other predators. She would become a shadow among the trees, a mythical figure, the old woman who walked with the legendary albino tiger. Her story would be told in whispers, a warning to those who dared to profane nature's sanctity. The inheritance her son so coveted, the money, the land, all of it turned to dust. The true inheritance, she realized, was life itself, freedom, the peace found in the wild. It was the wisdom of the forest, nature's resilience, the ability to rise from the ashes. And she, the mother who had been given up for dead, was now the embodiment of that resilience. The sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the forest in glorious light. The scent of pine and damp earth was her new perfume, the bird's song, her new melody. She did not miss the comfort of a home, the conveniences of a civilized life. Her home was the forest, her comfort, the tiger's presence, her convenience, nature's abundance. She was not just living, she was flourishing. The woman who had been broken by her own son's greed was now strong, rooted, unshakable. She was the silent voice of the forest, the guardian of its secrets, the protector of its life. And while the world outside continued its incessant pursuit of material things, she had found true wealth. A wealth that fire could not consume and greed could not corrupt. The legend had been born, and with it, a new dawn for the forest and for the woman who became a part of it. The new dawn was not just a daily event. It was the dawning of an era. The woman, now more forest than human, felt the earth's pulse in her veins, the wind's whisper in her ears, the ancestral wisdom of the trees in her soul. She was no longer the old mother of a greedy farmer, but the silent guardian of a sanctuary, a mythical figure woven into the very tapestry of nature. The albino tiger, her kindred spirit, her fierce guardian, was the extension of her will, a white spectre moving with supernatural grace between shadows and light. Days unfolded into a symphony of learning and connection. She discovered the forest's deepest secrets, which roots healed, which leaves nourished, where the purest water flowed. She learned to read the clouds, to predict storms, to understand the call of every creature. Her voice, once frail, now carried the soft tone of the breeze and the firmness of rock. Animals, once cautious, approached her without fear, recognizing in her an ally, a part of their own world. Deer, fawns, cunning foxes, even bears felt the aura of protection she and the tiger emanated. But peace, however profound, was not absolute. Tension lingered like a distant mist, the reminder that the world outside, the world of men, was relentless in its pursuit and its greed. Her son's disappearance, the barn in ashes, the absence of an old woman. These events could not remain unanswered forever. Human curiosity, the need to explain the inexplicable, to dominate the indomitable, was a force she knew would eventually clash with the limits of her sanctuary. And when that happened, she would be ready, not with the blind fury her son had demonstrated, but with the resolute stillness of one who understood balance, who defended life. The tiger, sensitive to the slightest change in the forest's energy, became more vigilant. Its growls, once murmurs of recognition, were now low warnings, directed at something that had not yet arrived but was on its way. The first signs came as whispers, then as rumors. Lumberjacks venturing deeper than usual reported glimpses of an ethereal figure, an old woman with white hair who seemed to move without touching the ground, always accompanied by a giant white tiger whose blue eyes gleamed like jewels in the gloom. Hunters told stories of inexplicably disarmed traps, of vanishing trails, of an oppressive sensation of being watched, of being unwanted. The forest, under her guardianship, seemed to have gained a will of its own, an insurmountable defense. Trees grew denser, swamps more treacherous, paths more confusing for those who came with profane intentions. She needed no weapons. The forest was her weapon. And the tiger, her shield. She guided the winds to confuse trackers, the mists to conceal paths, and the animals to divert intruders. The legend grew, fueled by fear and respect. The woman of the forest, the white guardian, the wild mother. The names varied, but the essence was the same. She was the personification of the forest, its voice, its fury, and its peace. Those who tried to explore, clear-cut, or poach illegally found themselves lost, disoriented, or faced the penetrating gaze of the albino tiger, a silent warning that chilled the soul. No one was ever harmed, but all were driven out, their tools broken, their intentions frustrated. The inheritance her son so coveted, the money, the land, the power, all of it turned to dust, irrelevant before the true wealth she had found. The wealth of freedom, of peace, of an unbreakable connection with wildlife. She had traded a world of greed for a realm of abundance, a realm where value was not measured in gold, but in every leaf that unfurled, in every stream that sang, in every heartbeat of the forest. The sun, as it set, painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, and she, sitting in a clearing with the tiger by her side, felt the day's energy dissipate, giving way to the night's stillness. She did not miss the comfort of a home, the conveniences of a civilized life. Her home was the forest, her comfort, the tiger's presence, her convenience, nature's abundance. The photograph of her son, which she still kept, was now just a distant reminder. A scar from a past that no longer defined her. She had forgiven, not out of weakness, but from the strength of understanding. He had chosen his path, and nature, in its relentless wisdom, had responded. She, in turn, had chosen life, protection, renewal. The legend had been born, and with it a new dawn for the forest and for the woman who became a part of it. And while the world outside continued its incessant pursuit of material things, she had found true wealth, a wealth that fire could not consume and greed could not corrupt. She was the guardian, the witness, the eternal voice of a world many had forgotten, but which she, with the albino tiger by her side, would protect forever. The cycle of destruction had ended, and the cycle of protection and renewal had been established, immortalized in the whispers of the wind and the silent roar of the forest.